Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. One of Hollywood's most famous stars lived in Connecticut toward the end of her rather shortened life. Marilyn Monroe, the sex symbol starlet who died of a drug overdose at age 36, lived in Roxbury with her third husband, playwright Arthur Miller. Now, celebrities love to live in Roxbury because the residents there tend to take the presence of famous people in stride. However, the day their engagement was announced in 1956, a Princess Diana-type car chase tragedy played out in Roxbury. We have three guests here today to help us tell the story about Marilyn Monroe in Roxbury, and all of them come from families with a long history in the Litchfield County town. Peter Hurlbut is Roxbury's longtime town clerk. Philo Hodges' family operated the only general store in town for decades. And Russ Wheeler had two unique connections with Monroe, which will amaze you. They'll be along in a moment with this fascinating story. This week's trivia question, 40 defenders with two cannons. They held off 1,200 British soldiers with 160 cannons. This during the War of 1812. In what Connecticut town did this occur? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Celebrities like to come to Roxbury, Connecticut because they're treated like normal human beings. Not a big deal. Privacy is respected. And there's not too much activity in Roxbury after all. Just one gas station, a general store, a deli, the town hall, and hundreds of gorgeous acres of land in the hills of Litchfield County. Well, Roxbury's had its share of famous residents, but none probably quite as famous as Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe's life story is certainly one of difficulty amid all of her fame and fortune. She was born Norma Jean Mortensen in Los Angeles in 1926, later baptized under a different name of Norma Jean Baker. She grew up with a single mother named Gladys, who struggled with mental illness, and Marilyn spent time in and out of orphanages and foster homes. Her father had to be identified through DNA testing. Turns out that Gladys had had an affair with Charles Gifford. He was a dairy farmer in California. That led to the birth of Marilyn. And she tried desperately to reach out to Gifford, her father, but he rebuffed her every time. Marilyn married her high school sweetheart, a guy named James Doherty, when she was just 16. And that marriage lasted 4 years. Later, in one of the more famous weddings of the time, Monroe married baseball legend Joe DiMaggio. Well, that marriage lasted just 9 months. Finally, she married a famous Connecticut playwright, Arthur Miller. For Miller, it was his second marriage. His first wife, Mary Grace Slattery, had famously supported him as he knocked out his main literary successes, namely Death of a Salesman and The Crucible. Miller and Monroe were married for 5 years, from 1956 to 1961. Much of the time, they were living at Miller's farmhouse in Roxbury. It dated back to 1785, and it had 325 acres with lots of fruit trees and a pond. For the most part, their time together was peaceful and uneventful, mainly because they were far from the hectic glare of the Hollywood life of movie stars. In fact, it was Miller who was drawing the headlines at the time more so than Monroe. You see, Senator Joe McCarthy, who led the so-called Red Scare hearings in Congress, had identified Miller as a communist. Miller was convicted of contempt of Congress, but Monroe's testimony helped to turn public opinion in his favor, and Miller never went to jail. So what was it like when Marilyn Monroe lived in Roxbury? Well, there simply aren't a lot of stories to tell because she was considered a resident just like everybody else. There was, of course, one very famous incident, the Princess Diana-like paparazzi car chase through Roxbury's dangerous back roads. It happened the day the couple was engaged back in 1956, and we'll have that story in just a bit. But first, what was it like having such a famous starlet in town? Well, for starters, just like every other citizen in a democracy, she had to register to vote. Well, here with that part of the story is Peter Hurlbut. He's the longtime town clerk of the town of Roxbury. He says he was too young at the time to remember lots of the details, but he's heard stories from his family handed down over the years. So, Pete, tell me about the time that Marilyn Monroe came to register to vote. I have a whole bunch of questions about this because she lived in town from 1956 to 1961. meaning she may have voted either for the Dwight Eisenhower election or the Kennedy-Nixon election, in terms of presidential. Tell me roughly what year, if you remember exactly when, and what that was about.
I unfortunately was too young to really have clear memory of any of it. But I do know that in those days, when you were registered as a voter, you had to appear before a board of admissions, which was the town clerk, the registrar of voters, and 2 members of the board of selectmen. And they met at the old Roxbury town hall. She would have been sworn in at that time. They walked across from the Hall of Records. They walked from there across to the town hall to where the voting machines were to show her how to vote. And all I know is my father was the one that swore her in and followed her across the parking lot to the town hall, and he thought it was a pretty good view from following her over. But aside from that, I have no memory of it.
Now, your dad, at family dinners, I'm sure this story came up many, many times. What did he say about Marilyn Monroe? Was she kind? Was she nice?
She seemed like a very nice person, very sweet. And the only memory he had of the whole situation was she had to ask Arthur, how do you spell Democrat?
Well, I guess that sort of tips the scales in terms of which way she was voting. You as town clerk now, and you've been in your town clerk role for a couple of decades, I believe we're talking about, right?
I'm coming up on 40 years if I survive.
So you've seen many famous people come in here to register to vote, I'm assuming. People like Dustin Hoffman, James Taylor. These people have to register to vote where they're living, right?
Hoffman, William Styron, Richard Widmark, a bunch of them.
Did you ever personally see Marilyn Monroe?
If I did, I don't remember. I honestly don't. All the others I've seen, met, had conversations with them and everything. Arthur Miller I met a number of times. But Marilyn, I was just too young. I was only like 6 or 7 years old. 6 or 7-year-old kids weren't supposed to be hanging around the town hall,
And people need to eat, no matter what their name and background. Roxbury really has only one general store, and for several decades it was operated by the father and grandfather of Philo Hodges. So Philo, tell me, first of all, a little bit about yourself. How long have you been in Roxbury? How long has your family been in Roxbury?
I've been in Roxbury my whole life. I'm living in the same house I was born and raised in. I moved away for a couple of years and then moved back when my parents died.
And so your family started operating really the only general store in Roxbury. Tell me the history of that.
Well, this store was built in 1935 by my father and grandfather at the time.
So it's really your father who interacted with Marilyn Monroe. So tell me, at the family dinner table, I'm sure this topic came up. What kind of stories were circulating around your dinner table?
A lot of the families in town were not enamored with the whole situation.
Why is that?
Because his first wife was a very nice person that everybody in town thought was put out to pasture when Marilyn showed up. So a lot of the old timers at the time did not appreciate it much.
So you have the only store in town. People need a carton of milk. They have to come down to the store. And I'm sure Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe.
Or they send somebody else to pick it up. Or they have it delivered.
So tell me what kind of stories you heard about when Marilyn actually came to the store.
People didn't flock to her, or they were just kind of let her alone. It wasn't a big deal to people in town.
And even famous people have to have their grass cut. And the person who ended up with that job was none other than Russ Wheeler. Russ wears 2 hats in this story. Both was the person who cut the grass and met Marilyn Monroe when he was there. And as we're going to hear a little bit later, he was a central figure in that paparazzi car crash involving reporters who were chasing Monroe and her fiancé, Arthur Miller. But more on that part just a little later on. So now let's first of all start off talking about how did you get the job to cut the grass at Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe's house?
It's a small town, and like the schools and stuff had very few people in it, but I was working kind of as a sweeper at the Roxbury garage, and the people before that owned the house evidently stopped for gas or something and wanted to know who they could get to mow their lawn. And the owner of the place said, well, this kid works everywhere, so, try him. So they came in and said, would you like a job? And I said, sure. I rode my bicycle up there, and I mowed their lawn for a number of times. And I'm not sure how that all worked when Marilyn Monroe was there, when they bought the place or whatever, but evidently the fellow that owned it before them told them I mowed the lawn. And consequently, they were down getting gas or something at the garage, and they asked where that fellow was, and Joe said, in the second bay. The fellow came in and said, we bought the place here, and he described it all. I said, yeah. And he said, I understand you mowed the lawn up there. And I said, yeah. And he said, do you want to continue? And I said, sure, fine. And I didn't know Marilyn Monroe from a whole lot of work. I never heard of her or anything else about it. And I went to work up there, and I mowed the lawn, and the woman came out with a glass of water or lemonade or something, and we sat right in the grass right beside the lawnmower, and she drank and I drank, and then we got up and I mowed the lawn again.
Do you remember at all what you talked about?
Heavens, no. She was just a neighbor lady. I didn't know. Fame and fortune was nothing that I was part of with her for anything. And at that time, if you worked for people in town or if you did something, lots of people offered you a glass of water or something on a hot day. It was not unusual. That was not an unusual thing to do. It was part of it. And if you had asked me her name that night, I wouldn't have known it.
When did you actually first realize that you had cut the grass at Marilyn Monroe's house?
Obviously, all of this stuff came to light right after the crash because there was big articles in the newspapers about it.
And yes, the crash was a very big deal in a town that doesn't see a lot of excitement. The day of the accident was the same day that Marilyn Monroe and Arthur Miller announced their engagement. Normally, of course, a happy event to be celebrated, but in Roxbury that day, happiness would turn to tragedy. Philo Hodges says that because his family's general store was right in the center of town, it was the focal point during the crash, especially right after it happened. The ambulance crew from the neighboring town of New Milford was the closest ambulance service to Roxbury, but that crew from New Milford didn't know where the accident had occurred. Now, Roxbury is full of tiny back roads that are particularly difficult to find for the uninitiated. Philo Hodges says that his dad was at the store when the accident happened. Let's talk about the day they got engaged. Tell me that story.
Well, they were headed home, I believe, is the story. And the roads to the house are very twisty and turny, and the reporters were chasing them. And they didn't make the corner and smashed into a tree.
So your dad is at the shop, and an ambulance shows up. What did the ambulance drivers ask?
They wanted to know how to get there. Well, my father said, I can try and tell you, but it probably would have taken a while.
And so Philo Hodges' dad jumped into the ambulance with the crew and directed them to the scene. At the scene, there was a lot of activity because there had been a fatality and a serious injury. Again, Russ Wheeler.
It was either a 55 or 56 Chevy car. And I remember that from the crash because the passenger side door was locked after the crash. And I crawled into what was left of the windshield and went down in kind of under the dash and unlocked that thing. And then they proceeded to get the person out of there. And all hell broke loose. I mean, there were cops around, and I'm sure that when the state police were notified that this had happened, they put an all-out on it, and cops came from all directions. The reason I was up there at that time is I was working at the garage. They called for the wrecker because this person was trapped, and Joe O'Brien owned the garage and the wrecker, and he hollered to me. I jumped in with him, and off we went. So that's how we got to the accident.
What did you see when you got to the site?
This car embedded into the tree. It looked like there were slide marks, skid marks, whatever, going into it. The car was just plain going too fast to make that corner. You got to remember, they're old roads that were just pushed wider from the dirt road, and they were tarred. And of course, we've got a wreck. There's one guy that's bleeding. There's a woman inside that's trapped in the vehicle. And the older cars were harder to get into than the newer ones today. So they were trying to pry the door open and get things going. But I remember going in and down over the windshield part that was broken and smashed out and getting the door unlocked. And when I came out, I thought, yeesh, what a mess. I was covered in blood. And of course, the woman didn't survive, and it wasn't difficult to tell that she was not surviving.
You were actually having to crawl over her body at that point, right?
Yeah, basically. But, when you're doing that sort of stuff, you aren't paying attention. Everybody's screaming and hollering, get the door open and this sort of stuff. And about, there were probably 2 or 3 people on the hood trying to get, but they were big people. So as a kid, I could crawl in there, no problem. Probably turn around and come back out. They couldn't. But, yeah, I went down in there and did that. And then we tried prying the door. I don't remember. I think Joe put a chain on it and pulled the door open with the wrecker. And a lot of confusion up there at the time.
Was the guy who was driving the car walking around the scene?
He was there, but I think he was pretty contained. I don't think he walked around much. I think his knees were injured in the crash. And of course, he was shaken up. I'm sure he was from, New York or something. He was not used to the road. The road had a very sharp turn up there. He was chasing Marilyn. And I think he was figuring that he was very close behind her, which was not true. They had gone up many minutes before the crash had happened. So him driving quickly didn't make sense. He was not going to catch them. And the ambulance arrived, and, like I said, a lot of confusion from all directions, a lot of state police involved. It was all town people or troopers that most of us knew anyhow. And after that, it was all quarantined off and nobody could get near it, and it sat there for quite a while. And Joe and I finally hooked onto it with the wrecker and took it down, put a tarp over it behind the garage, and never told anybody that we had it there. But then, a matter of a day or 2 later, they brought up a van truck and they managed to have a winch or something inside, and they towed the car inside, closed the door, nobody knew it was in there, and off it went.
The police were actually notified about the crash that day by the Millers themselves. It had occurred so close to their home that they heard it. Plus, their house featured the only telephone in that section of Roxbury at that time. Well, Arthur Miller and Marilyn Monroe lived together in Roxbury for 5 years, and then Monroe went out to Nevada in 1961 to make what would be her last movie, The Misfits, and then she would learn about a diary that Miller had kept, with one passage saying that he was embarrassed by her on occasion. After their divorce, Monroe was known to socialize with both John and Robert Kennedy. Many observers said their relationship involved affairs for both men. On May 19, 1962, Marilyn Monroe performed her infamous rendition of Happy Birthday to then-President John Kennedy at Madison Square Garden. And less than 3 months later, on August 4, 1962, Marilyn Monroe would be found dead in her bed in her Brentwood, California home from a drug overdose. She was 36. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. Well, Russ Wheeler shared one tactic used to preserve Marilyn Monroe's privacy back in the day. His boss at the Roxbury gas station used to purposely give the wrong directions to out-of-towners who were stopping by to look for Monroe's house, often taking them to the next town. I want to thank our 3 guests for today's program, all longtime residents of Roxbury. Peter Hurlbut, Roxbury's longtime town clerk. Philo Hodges, whose family operated the only general store in town for decades. And Russ Wheeler, who had 2 unique connections with Marilyn Monroe. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, 40 defenders with 2 cannons held off 1,200 British soldiers with 160 cannons, this during the War of 1812. Which Connecticut town was it? Well, the answer is Stonington. It's an amazing story of bravery, and next week on Amazing Tales CT, you're going to hear just how the waterfront community held off the far superior British Navy over a 4-day period. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and please stay healthy.